In this episode, we move from the big question of whether outsourcing creates risk into the more practical question of how to compare and evaluate third parties in a consistent way. A lot of organizations start vendor reviews with vague instincts like this vendor feels risky or this one seems fine, and that approach breaks down the moment you have more than a handful of vendors. Privacy management needs a repeatable method that works for a payroll provider, a marketing platform, a shredding service, and a cloud host without pretending they are all the same. The trick is to evaluate vendors using a few simple lenses that expose the real privacy impact of the relationship. The three lenses we'll focus on today are service type, access level, and processing activities. When you can describe a vendor clearly using those lenses, you can decide what level of due diligence is reasonable, what contract controls matter most, and what ongoing oversight is actually needed. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start with service type because it frames why the vendor exists in the first place and what kind of risk you should expect. A vendor providing physical mail services, for example, tends to touch limited data like names and addresses, but the risk might be misdelivery or loss. A vendor providing identity verification might process highly sensitive data, including government identifiers, and the risk might include fraud, profiling, or exposure. A cloud infrastructure provider might not care about the meaning of the data, but it controls the environment where everything runs, so the risk is about broad access, resilience, and security design. A customer support outsourcer might interact with people directly, so the risk includes what agents say, what they record, and what they can see. Service type is not a label for judgment. It is a clue about the likely data involved, the likely touchpoints, and the likely failure modes. Once you understand the service type, you can stop using one-size-fits-all reviews and start focusing attention where it matters. The second lens is access level, which is often the fastest way to spot why a vendor relationship is high risk even if the service sounds harmless. Access level is about how close the vendor gets to personal data and what kinds of actions they can take with it. Some vendors never access personal data at all, even if they support a business process, like a company that repairs office furniture. Some vendors access personal data indirectly, like an IT provider that can see data while troubleshooting systems. Some vendors have routine, continuous access, like a hosted platform that stores your customer records and processes them every day. Access can also be read-only or read-write, which matters because changing data can create integrity issues and downstream harm. Another important distinction is whether access is controlled by your organization, such as through accounts you manage, or controlled by the vendor, such as through their internal support tools. The more independent and privileged the access, the more you need strong controls, monitoring, and contractual clarity. A helpful way to make access level feel real is to imagine what the vendor could do at 2 a.m. without asking your permission. If the vendor can copy a dataset to troubleshoot a problem, that is a higher risk access level than a vendor who can only view limited fields through a restricted interface. If the vendor can create new user accounts, reset passwords, or change permissions, that is elevated privilege that can become a privacy incident even without malicious intent. If the vendor can export data in bulk, that changes your exposure because bulk export turns an ordinary mistake into a large-scale event. Even when the vendor is trustworthy, wide access increases the chance of accidents, misconfiguration, and the kind of small shortcuts that seem reasonable during urgent work. Privacy risk is not only about bad actors, it is about normal humans under time pressure. So access level is a practical proxy for how much harm could occur if something goes wrong. The third lens is processing activities, which is the privacy manager's way of saying what exactly is happening to the data. Processing includes collecting, recording, organizing, structuring, storing, altering, retrieving, using, disclosing, transmitting, combining, restricting, and deleting. You do not need to memorize that list to use the concept, but you do need to recognize that different activities create different risks. Storing data creates retention and breach risk, while analyzing data can create inference and fairness risks. Sharing data with subcontractors creates transparency and transfer risks. Deleting data can create risk too if deletion is incomplete or inconsistent across backups. When you evaluate a vendor, you want to identify the specific activities the vendor performs and the reason each activity exists. If you cannot explain why the vendor needs to perform a certain activity, that is a sign you may be accepting unnecessary processing, which is often unnecessary risk. It is also important to notice that service type, access level, and processing activities reinforce each other rather than standing alone. A vendor might have a simple service type, like printing invoices, but a high access level if they receive a full customer profile with purchase history and contact details. Another vendor might have a complex service type, like a cloud platform, but a limited access level if everything is encrypted and the vendor cannot view content. A vendor might have moderate access level but risky processing activities if they combine data from multiple clients to build models or benchmarks. This is why categorizing vendors only as low, medium, or high risk without explaining why is not very useful. A better approach is to describe the relationship using the three lenses first, then derive the risk rating. When you do it in that order, your decisions become defensible and easier to communicate to procurement, security, and business owners. Now let's connect these lenses to a simple evaluation workflow that avoids turning into endless paperwork. First, identify the service type in plain language and confirm the business purpose, because a vendor doing something that is not clearly tied to a legitimate purpose is automatically suspect. Next, map the access level by asking what systems the vendor can reach, what data fields they can see, whether access is persistent or occasional, and whether they can export or modify data. Then, document the processing activities at a high level, focusing on the life cycle. What data enters, what is done to it, where it is stored, who it is shared with, and how it is removed. Finally, use what you learned to decide the depth of due diligence, the key contract controls, and the ongoing oversight plan. The point is not to create perfect documentation, but to create enough clarity to prevent blind trust. Blind trust is what causes surprises later, and surprises are expensive in privacy work. A common beginner mistake is assuming that all third parties who touch personal data should be evaluated with the same questionnaire. That feels fair, but it wastes attention on low-impact vendors, and it fails to dig deeply enough for high-impact vendors. A cleaning service that might incidentally see printed documents does not need the same technical review as a vendor hosting a customer database. What it needs is physical safeguards, confidentiality expectations, and clear handling instructions for any found documents. Meanwhile, a software platform with continuous access needs security controls, incident reporting, retention management, support for rights requests, and evidence of those capabilities. So evaluation should be proportional, meaning it scales with service type, access level, and processing activities. Proportional does not mean relaxed, it means focused. When privacy teams are focused, they gain credibility because they are not blocking everything. They are protecting what matters. Another misconception is thinking that access level is purely a technical topic, something only security should care about. Privacy management cares about access because privacy incidents often happen through legitimate access used in the wrong way. A support agent with broad access might view a record out of curiosity, even if they never export it. A contractor might take screenshots to document a bug, unintentionally capturing personal data. A vendor might use real customer data in a test environment because it is convenient. None of those require hacking, and all of them create privacy harm and accountability issues. So privacy evaluation should ask questions that expose the reality of access controls, such as whether access is role-based, time-limited, logged, reviewed, and restricted from bulk export. The goal is not to audit every detail, but to ensure the vendor's access model matches the sensitivity of the data and the expectations you have promised to individuals. Processing activities also help you spot risks that are not obvious from access alone, especially around combining data or using it for secondary purposes. A vendor might have limited access to direct identifiers, but still perform analytics that build profiles, segments, or predictions about individuals. That can trigger privacy expectations about fairness, transparency, and the right to object, depending on the context. Another vendor might store data only briefly but transmit it to multiple other systems as part of an integration, creating a chain of disclosure you must understand. A vendor might receive data that is already pseudonymized, but then combine it with other data sources to re-identify it, which changes the risk dramatically. So processing activity mapping should include whether the vendor enriches data, derives new data, shares data onward, or retains data for long periods. If you do not ask about derived data and onward sharing, you can miss the most impactful privacy issues entirely. It also helps to consider data categories as part of describing processing activities, because sensitivity changes what reasonable controls look like. Basic contact data may require strong access control and retention limits, but it may not require the same restrictions as biometric data, precise location, or data about children. Some data is sensitive because it can cause direct harm if misused, like financial account details or health information. Some data is sensitive because it enables manipulation or discrimination, like detailed behavioral profiles. When you evaluate a vendor, you want to know whether they will process special categories of data and whether they will process data at scale. Scale matters because a small mistake can become a major incident if millions of records are involved. Sensitivity and scale also influence what you require contractually, such as tighter breach notification timelines or stronger encryption and logging expectations. Once you have categorized a vendor through these lenses, you can tie the result to specific privacy management actions. A low-access vendor with limited processing may only need basic contractual safeguards and periodic confirmation that nothing changed. A vendor with privileged access may need stronger controls like access logging, background checks for certain roles, and defined procedures for how support interacts with live data. A vendor performing complex processing like analytics or identity verification may require detailed documentation of how decisions are made, what data is used, how long it is retained, and how individuals' rights are supported. A vendor with international operations may require special attention to transfer constraints and subprocessor management. The evaluation becomes a decision engine. It tells you which questions to ask, which clauses to prioritize, and which monitoring to do. That is how you prevent vendor management from becoming a noisy ritual and instead make it a targeted risk control system. One last piece that beginners often overlook is that vendor evaluation is not a one-time event because service type, access level, and processing activities can change. A vendor might expand features, add analytics, change hosting regions, or introduce new subcontractors. Your organization might start using new modules, connecting new datasets, or granting broader access to solve operational pain. So a mature approach includes triggers for reassessment, such as contract renewal, major feature changes, incidents, or onboarding new data types. You do not need to redo everything constantly, but you do need a way to notice when the relationship's risk profile has shifted. In practice, this is where privacy management works closely with procurement, security, and the business owner, because those groups often hear about changes first. The value of the three lenses is that they give you a shared language. If any of the three shifts, you know it is time to look again. To wrap this up, evaluating third parties becomes much easier when you stop trying to judge vendors by reputation alone and start describing the relationship with discipline. Service type tells you what kind of work is happening and what risks tend to come with it. Access level tells you how much power the vendor has over personal data and how quickly a mistake could become serious. Processing activities tell you what is actually done to the data throughout its life cycle, including sharing, derivation, and deletion. When you combine the three, you get a clear picture of privacy impact that supports proportional due diligence, smarter contracts, and realistic oversight. This method is also exam-friendly because it reflects how privacy management is meant to operate. You identify risk based on processing reality, you align controls to that risk, and you keep the organization accountable even when someone else is doing the work. If you can explain a vendor relationship using these lenses in plain language, you are already thinking like a privacy manager.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.